Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2025 Bluefield Prom walkthrough. Yes, a little bit of round of applause. Those graduates, it's warm back there. Couple of things before we start. The graduates will be stopping here. They'll do a walkthrough all the way to that arch. They'll turn around and have their picture taken, and they'll enjoy a night in Paris. Before we begin, we'd like to thank a few people, especially the graduates themselves. The prom committee would kindly ask that everyone be respectful of all graduates. So if your last name starts with A and you want to get up, well, the Zeelinger's got you, because you should stay until the Zeds get through so that there's no hustle and bustle and every graduate kind of gets through. We'd also like to thank all the Bluefield families for their generous donations to the prom this year. It was amazing. We have a great Bluefield family, and we take pride in that. They'd also like to thank our community sponsors, including our three major sponsors: Kay's Wholesale, Goods Independent, and the Hunter River Lions Club. Now, there we go. Without further ado, the first couple. Please welcome Olivia LeBlanc and guest Jax Ulstall. Please welcome Valeria Aguila. Please welcome Quinn Turner, graduate, and guest Ingrid Farrell. Please welcome graduate Sequoia Rattray and Olivia Kelly. Please welcome Amy Morse and Griffin Pickard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Addison Smith and guest Chad McNally. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Kayla Story and graduate Matthew Sims. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Luke Brosha and guest Reem Bakir. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Michael Steele and guest Cadence Weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Connor Richards and guest Claudia Cabello. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Swen Vermont and guest Grace Soulis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Adia Cruz and Ramadan Al Gathif. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Orleas Pike and guest Madison Rankin Myers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jordan Bergman and guest Emily McLeod. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Emma Gallant and guest Connor Robertson. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Riley McGee and guest Dylan McLean. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Josie McLean and graduate Nevin Newsom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ellie Booth and guest Jake Kelly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Bailey Cody and graduate Nikki Chason. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ethan Grant and guest Grace Waugh. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lauren McAleer and guest Seth Hansen. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Emily Holmes and graduate Stephen Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jessica Clark and graduate Browan LeDrew. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Andrew McDougall and guest Peyton Lowther. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Austin Potts and guest Cassidy Holmes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Callie McDougall and graduate Will Sanderson. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Noah Flynn and guest Claudia Clemens. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jake Niver and guest Haley Bernard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kai Rodell and guest Amelia McQuarrie. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Haley Mazurik and graduate Dominic Jenkins. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ashton Cormier and guest Maddie Shields. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sky Hines and graduate Terrence Sherpler. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Zach Blanchard and guest Peyton Ledger Ford. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lachlan Kennedy and graduate Marissa Huggin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Haley Bond and guest Cohen Doucette. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Matthew Bell and guest Cheyenne Gillis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Mark Palfy and guest Lexi Kowalski. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Brian Handrahan and guest Fabian Fritter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Elisa Valhana, sorry, one of my favorite peer helpers, and I had to screw up her name, and graduate Kane Wood. Oh, well. Just the three? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduates Aaron Debora, Marion McTavish, and Ava Gavin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Kyler McLeod and graduate Carissa Lane. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Emma Story and graduate Nathan Shakespeare. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to graduate Brendan Carr and guest Riley Lake. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ashley McKinnon and guest Ryan Dickey. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Olivia McDougall and graduate Zachary Farhar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Carmen Nicholson Shaw and guest Weston Vardy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jace McPherson and guest Shelby Peters. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Nolan McLeod-Peters, graduate Cameron Smith, and graduate Jacob Gillis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Owen Mason and guest Kayla McKinnon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ryan McKenzie and guest Sabrina Shaw. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Dustin Shaw and guest Chloe Pino. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Hannah Ford and guest Alla Jameson. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Casey Robinson and graduate Georgia Forrest. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Jessica Noya and graduate Brooklyn Taylor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Alyssa Mills and guest Daniel Burgoyne. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Bethany Blanchard and graduate Brianna Picard. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Hannah LeBlanc and graduate Kira Duran. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome graduate Kira Palogi and guest Denise Tomacanalo. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome grad Ariana Piva and guest Ada Marino. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Yuan Fawn Lin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Madison Gauthier. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sarah Versteeg and graduate Hazen Wigmore. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Leah Sentner and graduate Aiden Havinga. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lily Sanderson and guest Alex Bernard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Bristol Lee Vanderkoy, graduate Taylor Thompson, and graduate Isabel LeClaire. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Hudson Haltley and guest Lauren Monkley. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Braden Corbett and guest Charlie Webster. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Kaylin Belfry and guest Emma Harris. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jordan Noble and guest Addison Edwards. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ellie Gallant and guest Alyssa McLeod. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Liam Farkley and Emily Thompson Press. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Abby Mahoney and graduate Jack Buchanan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Emma Ashley and graduate Ryan Vander Gervig. I must apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Christopher Neal. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chloe Kindevong and Marin Evans. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Samantha Lamont and graduate Maya Colburn. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Mary Beth Rayner and graduate Zen Porter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jamie Juke and Circe Webster. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Noah Norton and guest Gwen McCachran. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Brianna McCardle and guest Samuel McGinnis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Molly McCourt and guest Thomas Hattie. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lily Shepard and guest Homer Selman. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Emma McDougall, graduate, and guest Giselle Amasilia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sarah Fung and graduate Alex Gallant. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Tabitha Angel and graduate Seamus Hurley. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Charlotte Dolman and graduate Camden Demings. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Emma Proud and graduates Michaela Dumcombe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sam Bridges and guest Sarah Bell. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Trip Paintner and guest Carissa Zettel. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to make an exception. I mispronounced a few names because they come in cards that when it says over, you know they have a long name. I don't want to mess it up, so you guys are going to introduce yourselves. You are the lovely
Maya Longley.
And you are?
Andrei Nazaryukhin.
Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you graduates Erica Kennedy and graduate Harry Murnion. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Nicole Servette and graduate Asher Martin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Naomi Forbes and guest Nate Ford. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Mina Drake and guest Chase Walters. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Miles Nielsen and guest Adrian Scales. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Wyatt McLeod and guest Katie Sutcliffe. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jeremiah DeVries Paparoni and guest Julia Kane. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jackson Coles and guest Mila Campbell. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lachlan Dykstra and graduate Rachel Campbell. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Daniel Clark and guest Claire Connolly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Allie Bowers and graduate Nate McDonald. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Maeva Goche and graduate Evan Weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Luke Inman and graduate Regan Hunter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Caleb Voss and guest Emily Lutley. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Rachel McFadgen and graduate Callum King. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sophie Leclerc and guest Cole Belanger-Burt. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Isaac Tweel and guest Alicia Cameron. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Harrison Monroe and graduate Ashlyn Tremere. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Araya Pott and graduate Isaac Frazier. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tyler Jenkins-Goody and Calista Terriolt. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Aidan Gwindon and guest Isabel McKinnon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Nick Frizzle and guest Hallie Linton. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Leah McQuarrie and graduate Duke Willis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Isabel Craig and guest Alex Nicholson. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Peter Steele and guest Janessa Dyson. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jacob Frank and guest Taylor Lidstone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate PK King Putza and guest Phoebe Rankin Marshall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Owen McCarthy and graduate Kaylee Willis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Piper Michelin and graduate Cole Irwin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Jocelyn Landry and Jaden Summers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sam Stewart and graduate Jane Butler. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Luca Hall and guest Emma Pickering. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Carissa McKay and guest Megan Esterbrooks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Julia Clough and guest Finley Maskey. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Owen Godfrey and guest Emma Arnett. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jordan Roberts and guest Katie Connolly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Lincoln Trainer and guest Jaden McKinnon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Harley Ford and guest Braden Way. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Damian Corney and guest Naomi Essery. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Jay Daraj and Addison Hughes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Addison Langley and guest Noah McDonald. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Alexis Marshall and guest Ethan McFadgen. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Natalia Gilroy and graduate David Inman. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Kate Crabb and guest Baden Jack. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Abby Murray and guest Adam McDonald. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ella Lenentine and graduate Kale Larter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Braden Ranahan and guest Claire Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ben Wood and guest Lily Flanagan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Sam Langdale and guest Jada Lazarick. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Drake Tyler and graduate Olivia Bourgeois. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduates Grace Percy and guest Tegan Mahar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Ellie Worth. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Saif Mahar and guest Lucas Thibault. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Braxton Stead and guest Nicole Weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Jaden DeRoche Pollock and guest Drew Sutherland. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Harley Hines and graduate Hayden Cannon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Kason Acorn and guest Sophie Hilton. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Gavin Gallant and graduate Grayson Peters. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome graduate Kai Smith. And ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up the 2025 graduating prom ceremony, please welcome Si Tong Siobhan. He's a little shy, so I appreciate the applause. And ladies and gentlemen, there couldn't be a happier note to wrap up the 2025 graduation prom walkthrough. I'd like to thank all those people that made it possible and all the graduates, of course. Have a safe graduation. Thank you for coming.